Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today is this month's patron pick. Thank you so much to all of my wonderful supporters on Patreon. The topic that was chosen this month is a practical one with a great potential for controversy: reversing decisions. This is a topic that's very difficult to create a policy for because you need to balance the needs of two camps that are at odds with each other. On the one hand, it's frustrating to play against someone who asks for takebacks all the time, and you would expect that at highly competitive or professional level play, you wouldn't see this sort of thing a whole lot. On the other hand, Magic is a complicated game, and it's important to have a system that's flexible enough to accommodate when people inevitably make mistakes, especially mistakes of execution, which is not part of the core set of skills Magic tests. Magic does not have anything similar to the touch move rule in chess, and it would be very difficult to imagine how such a rule could be implemented in a fair way. Because of this difficulty, the written policy on the topic of reversing decisions is very brief. I can summarize it in just one sentence. Players are only allowed to take back decisions if they have not gained any new information since the decision was communicated. Now, if that's all you needed, be sure to leave a like and a comment so the algorithm doesn't punish me too hard for putting the good stuff up front. For everyone else, or at least the people who looked down at the timestamp and wondered what I would be talking about for the next few minutes, let's talk a little bit about how this philosophy is applied in practice and some of the complications that can come up. First off, let's examine a few scenarios where a player is allowed to take back plays. Maybe Amy plays an island and then before anything else says, "Oh, sorry, I meant to play a swamp," and changes them out. Or maybe Amy attacks Nick and he says no blocks, immediately followed by, "Wait, no, I'll block with grizzly bears." Or let's say Amy says go. "No, wait, land go." Now, these are all examples taken essentially verbatim straight out of the Magic tournament rules of situations where players are allowed to reverse decisions, and hopefully these seem reasonable to you. I, for one, have certainly made plays like this in my games, as has pretty much every player that I know. Let's notice a common theme running through all of them: time. All of the cases given as examples say that the player who wants to reverse a decision does so immediately after it's been communicated. This is important because a player is only allowed to make a different decision if they have not gained any new information since communicating the original decision. The interpretation of what counts as gaining information has historically been very broad. For example, let's say that Amy declares some attackers and then sets her hand face down on the table waiting for Nick to decide on blockers. Nick then pauses for a couple seconds, puts one of his creatures in front of one of Amy's attackers and says block here. After this, Amy picks up her hand, starts going through it. Seeing this, Nick says, "Wait, actually no blocks. Would you let Nick take this block back?" Well, the clear answer here is no. Even though Amy might not have said anything, her actions made it clear that she was intending to cast a combat trick. Nick might not know what specific card Amy was looking for in her hand, but the fact that she was doing so is definitely enough to influence his evaluation of whether or not it would be a good idea to block here. Now, for a somewhat subtler example. Amy attacks with two creatures, Nick blocks one of them, and then pauses. Amy picks up her pen to mark the life total change, at which point Nick says, "Actually, I'll block the other creature." The evaluation is a bit less obvious in this scenario, but the correct ruling is that this would also not meet the standard set out in the MTR. In this case, Nick has gained information in the form of knowing that Amy does not have a combat trick she intends to play, since she has moved directly to the part where Nick takes combat damage. The evaluation changes if Amy has no cards in hand. In that case, Nick is not gaining any new information by the fact Amy does not intend to play her combat trick. He already knew that she wasn't going to because she didn't have one in the first place. Similar logic may hold if Amy did have cards in her hand, but Nick had previously been able to look at her hand and thus knows what those cards are. Another factor to consider, though, is that merely knowing that Amy has a combat trick doesn't necessarily mean Nick didn't gain any information when Amy moves to play it. Rather, he now does have additional information about Amy's intention to play that combat trick, which could be relevant in his decisions. As you can see, the determination can get pretty murky, and this is all before we consider the biggest practical issue at play in these kind of judge calls, which is that when you talk to the players about what happened, Amy will insist that she practically had the neck snap face up on the table and was in the process of tapping mana, while Nick will deny ever seeing such a thing take place. Now, the really crazy part is that as a result of well-documented cognitive biases, it's very plausible that both players in a case like this sincerely believe their own account of what happened is correct, and that's putting aside the obvious incentives each player has to, let's just say, selectively remember only the parts of the situation that would make their side look stronger. So what should a judge do in a case like this? Well, here's a couple of guidelines. The first thing to observe is that all of the policy surrounding reversing decisions comes from the MTR. Now this means, hypothetically, it applies exactly the same at all levels of Magic play, from F&M all the way up to the Pro Tour. And if you're a judge, you know that is definitely not the case in practice. Every judge I know is much more permissive of reversing decisions at lower level Magic events than at higher level. I remember one particular story from my first day 2 on the main event of a Grand Prix, where my mentor handled a call involving this topic. It was pretty clear that one of the players was going to be very sad after the ruling was issued. It was just a matter of which one. After hearing what had happened, this judge looked at the board and then looked at each player in turn and then said, "It's professional rel." And that was the end of it. No arguments, no complaints, just a look of resigned disappointment from the player who was not able to take back his play. Sometimes both players willingly agree to allow something, but if not, it's much more likely that a judge will allow a player to reverse a decision at regular rel than at competitive or professional. I feel like I should at least mention kitchen table games here because people are curious about that too. And I know this is the case because people ask me this sort of thing from time to time. A lot of these questions read like someone is upset about what just happened to them and really wants to hear a judge say that they're right. So, you know what? You're absolutely right, and your friends are all morons. Hope that helps. Flippancy aside, I've absolutely no jurisdiction at a kitchen table match. The actual answer to any question, but especially one that involves the phrase, "Can I take that back?" is whatever you and the other people at your table can all agree on. Now, the next thing after the setting that I consider is the relevance of the information that might have been gained. For example, let's imagine Amy says, "Pass turn," and then Nick says, "End step, exile your graveyard with Thraben Charm." And then Amy says, "Wait, I forgot to play a land." Now, I think it's pretty uncontroversial to say that Amy probably wanted to play a land regardless of whether Nick had a play or not. In other words, it's pretty unlikely that the information Amy gained affected her decision to want to play a land. The less relevance the information that might have been gained has on the decision that the player is trying to reverse, the more likely I am to allow it as a judge. This is debatably supported in policy by this line here. Some stricter judges might not agree with this point, and I will caution that even in relatively straightforward cases, the judge needs to carefully evaluate what's going on. For example, in the situation that I described, it's probable that Amy's decision of whether to play a land was not affected, but it's conceivable that the information about Nick playing a Thraben Charm might have affected which land Amy wanted to play if she had multiple different options available. Another thing to consider is the amount of time that has passed since the player communicated the decision that they want to reverse. This is important not only for the reasons that were noted earlier regarding how a reaction, or even a lack thereof, might constitute information that a player has gained, but also because taking new information into account is not instantaneous. How many times have you been sitting there waiting for your opponent to just pass the turn so you can make a play, only to see it finally happen, quickly untap and draw for the turn, and then start tanking yourself after seeing the card that you just drew? Even if new information was revealed, if the takeback was requested close enough to when that information happened, it's plausible that the information might not have influenced that request. For this reason, the less time that's passed, the more likely I am to allow a player to reverse a decision. And finally, the last piece of advice that I have is to investigate what happened via the only tool that's often available, player interviews. Normally when I take a call, I ask the players what happened and allow them to explain their respective sides at the table with both players present. Usually this is the best way to go because players are generally pretty cooperative, and in case one player doesn't agree with the other's account, it's quicker and easier to arrive at an account both players can agree on if they're both present. For situations like the one that we're considering though, once it's clear that the players will not both agree on what happened, I'll separate them and ask each one what happened individually. This generally does take longer and may increase the tension in the ruling, but it has the plus side of having a better chance of getting good information, especially if one of the players is too shy or intimidated to stand up to direct conflict. Like all investigations, acquiring information and stitching it together into a workable narrative is as much art as science, and even those who are highly experienced sometimes get it wrong. But as a judge, you're here to make those tough calls, and you do the best that you can. Because these rulings are by their nature so controversial, and because the judge is frequently required to base such rulings on whichever player's story sounded more credible rather than any objective criteria, I'll close out by recommending a few best practices for players to help mitigate the risk of something awkward happening that could affect the course of your game. The first and most powerful principle is timing. Any substantial pause is generally interpreted as meaning a player has finished taking game actions or proposing future game actions. By allowing such a pause in the action before taking any responses, a player can typically avoid an opponent asking for takebacks. The second bit of advice is communication. Many rulings involving this topic result from a player taking a game action which reveals information and the other player arguing that they were still in the process of finalizing their previous decision. Confirming the game state with your opponent before taking a game action is the best way to avoid a situation like this coming up. Or, if you're on the other side, verbally confirming that you're thinking rather than waiting for a response. For example, if you are about to cast a combat trick after your opponent's declared blockers, you might consider confirming by asking, "Still thinking?" before you cast it. Or if you're blocking and moving your creatures around to help you visualize, you might note that to your opponent that that's what you're doing, and that you will verbally declare when those blocks are final. And that's reversing decisions. Today I've covered the policy and philosophy around this topic from both a theoretical and practical perspective, looked at the various factors a judge would consider that might make a favorable ruling more or less likely, and given some advice to players to help mitigate the risk of bad beat story involving this topic in one of your games. That's all I have for you today. Thank you again to all of my lovely supporters on Patreon. Join me again next time for another daily ruling. Until then, I hope you have a great day.